You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
Welcome back to the Social Workers Live radio talk show. We are here this morning in the halfway through the month of April. It's a little unusual for us. Typically, the Social Workers airs at on the first Thursday of every month at 9 a.m., but we're on today. I'm here with my co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hi, Eric. I'm so excited to be here today. Today's
going to be a fascinating interview. We have with us by telephone, we have editor and author Harry Rosenfeld. Harry Rosenfeld is a lifelong advocate of social justice. Harry has spent several years as an editor at the New York Herald Tribune and the Washington Post. As the Metro editor at the Post, he oversaw Woodward and Bernstein in the Pulitzer Prize-winning expose of Watergate. After leaving the Post, Mr. Rosenfeld began working with the Albany Times-Union and the Knickerbocker News. Although he retired in 1998, he continues to serve as a consultant to the Times-Union and sits on the editorial board as editor-at-large. In 2013, Harry wrote his memoir, From Kristallnacht to Watergate, Memoirs of a Newspaperman, which is a recounting of his childhood in 1930s Berlin under Nazi rule and his career path from the New York Herald Tribune to the Washington Post. Welcome, Harry. Can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Great. We're very excited to have you on. Thanks. It's a huge honor for us.
It's a pleasure for me.
Great. So we wanted to start off by just asking, there's so much in your biography. You've had such an incredible life, an incredible story, and there's so much to share with our listeners. I'm wondering, maybe if we could start talking a little bit about how your experience growing up in Nazi Germany influenced your decision to go into journalism.
Well, it did, I think, but that knowledge about myself came late in life when I sat down to write my memoir.
Interesting.
I make the connection all that much while I was growing up or while I was going into my work because I wasn't that self-conscious about it, and I didn't have the time to be reflective about it. At least I didn't make the time. I was busy carving out a career for myself, which was hard enough. And it wasn't until I looked back on my life that that connection seemed to me to be fundamental, and the recognition that these sorts of abuses and frightening things that I felt or saw during my youth in Nazi Germany shaped the kind of attitudes that I had as a young man growing up in America. And I early on decided before I graduated from high school that I wanted to do something of public service, and that it struck me that journalism, working in newspapers, was the one that would suit me best.
What was it about journalism? What was it? I mean, you have such a, like I said, an extensive career in journalism. What was it that that attracted you to that?
Because I did see it as a form of public service. Now, other ways to do public service is to be a teacher, or as one of my professors in college urged me to do, become a diplomat. There are many ways to render public service. But the one that I found most congenial was that even as a youngster, when I was reading newspapers, I saw that they made a valuable contribution to public life. I'm not talking about the sensational aspect one also sees, from the tawdry side of journalism. I'm talking about the kinds of things where wrongdoings were exposed and systems were held up to scrutiny by the press.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, as I mentioned in the intro, Harry, your whole life has been characterized by this commitment to social justice, and we certainly in the social work profession have tried to build a profession and build a career for ourselves dedicated to combating social injustice. And I hope as we talk for the next 30 minutes or so that we can hear a little bit about how that concept of social justice and fighting against some of the more oppressive forces in society has shaped you, that ability to speak out, I guess, if you will.
I think it's fundamental to good journalism, and it's implicit that why do you do this thing? You do this thing, first of all, in order to hold people accountable who need to be held accountable, and to hold them to the rules that exist, or to write about, do the reporting that becomes the basis for creating new rules in order to make this a more just and humane society. And I think in the time that I was blessed to be in this field, a lot of this happened and transpired historically, in which journalism played its role. I'm talking about the civil rights movement, and I'm talking about the anti-Vietnam War movement, and I'm talking about Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, and there was so much of this that in which justice and social justice was implicit.
Mm-hmm. There's a quote from your book where you talked about the New York Herald Tribune and your experience there, and I think you said something to the effect that one of the things that attracted you to the Herald Tribune was its ability to unnerve. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that? What is the ability to unnerve? And maybe for our listeners, explain that a bit.
I think what it did was it was very venturesome in the topics that it would undertake. It was an establishment paper for sure, but it was also a venturesome paper, and it took a different eye slant on what was happening, and it picked up the curtain and looked behind it. And some of the distinguished reporting, I remember Homer Biggard's particularly, had that kind of spirit, that kind of energy, especially during the McCarthy hearings and so forth. Mm-hmm. And that was by a paper that would be classified as a Republican paper, although a liberal Republican paper, but it conveyed a spirit that. Well, look, I'm sure we had sacred cows, but our sacred cows were different from other people's sacred cows. And so we were able to look at things and ready to look at things that others didn't pay as much attention to.
So you've covered so many important stories. You talked about the Watergate. What was that experience like for you to be able to raise this awareness and inform the public about these issues that were critical that they know about? So what was it like to you to sort of be on that front end of being able to get this information out?
Well, I'll pick Alyssa, what you said at the end is what was the motivating factor. Get the information out. That's what it was about. It wasn't to do social justice. It wasn't about doing justice even. It was about getting the story out. And the story was, to begin with, a burglary in the Democratic National Headquarters, which from the beginning had aspects that were fascinating, namely that one chap was connected to this, had been connected to the CIA. The other burglar carried $50,000 in $50 bills that were in series, and the third thing was that a name was in a burglar's telephone book that had the notation next to Howard Hunn's name of W. House. I mean, so even in the first 3 days, we knew this was a special story, and what we were engaged in was finding out what in heaven's name happened here. What was behind this burglary? 5 men in Democratic National Headquarters? Obviously, they're not there to rob the safe of any monies. They were there for political purposes. So that was our motivation. And that was our motivation throughout. We weren't on a campaign, on a political vendetta to hunt down Nixon and his minions. We were on a campaign to find out the truth.
As a witness to, personal witness for you to so many different important events in American history and in world history, it sounds like maybe you did have a sense, but I'm curious, what did you really know at the time that this was happening at Watergate, how big this would be, how important this would be historically for our nation? Absolutely not.
No. I even though as within 2 weeks I knew it was pretty important, when John Mitchell resigned as head of the committee to re-elect the president, I knew then that this was going deeper than even I had thought up to that time. But did I think the president would resign? No. Did I think it would even reach the president? No. And when I had enough information to even, in my mind, hold the thought that it could be possible, I suppressed it, because my job was to make sure that our reporting was strictly truthful and accurate, and not let any other thoughts sway our reporting and our standards. We had to be meticulous in making sure that we were right in what we were reporting, and we were not letting our political biases and inclinations lead us someplace.
That's true journalism right there. Just hearing you describe those motives and how you wanted to get the accurate story out. I think today with 24-hour media, sometimes all of that gets lost, and I just want to say that's really what true journalism is. So
it's a different world today, Alyssa. A really different world, and the dynamics of the whole world, but certainly of journalism and media, has changed enormously, and things do get out. The problem, not the problem, a problem with this new world is that what gets out forever to be on the record is often very unsubstantiated, unvetted, uncritically examined, which in the best days of the print press was done. I mean, the process of getting a newspaper story into print compared to today, it took an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of effort by many different people. Today, somebody sees something, they send it out there, and boom, it's there. Now you can withdraw it within minutes, but it doesn't matter. It's still there, and I think that's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah. But even just like how you were saying, that was your goal, was to get the accurate story out. That's something that I think for you and all the work that you've done, it shows. And I think that's why you had such an extensive career and have been so successful, was because of that drive to be accurate and to inform others. So I thank you for that and your contributions.
Yeah, and it seems to me also, Harry, like you've really upheld this, the concept of freedom of information seems to be a running thread throughout your life, that, finding the accurate information that's out there, sharing it, and making sure that the general public has access to the information that they deserve and that they need. And in some ways, I feel like historically that's a really bold stance to have taken, and you really are a hero in some ways for doing that.
Embarrass me, I don't feel it.
So you've also spent, you spent a number of years as an editor, both, at the Washington Post and then here in Albany at the Times-Union. Can you talk a little bit about what brought you to Albany and what attracted you to this area?
Well, what brought me to Albany was the chance to run not one but two newspapers. I had been, through my years at the New York Herald Tribune and at the Washington Post, I had achieved a fairly high level of responsibility, but they were never more than running a department. That was important, but I never ran a newspaper. And as I grew in experience, I recognized that having been satisfied with running a department for many, many years, I thought I now had enough skills, I had learned enough that I think I could run a whole newspaper. And once that bug bit me, then that's what I wanted to do. That was insofar as I had a career goal, that was my career goal from that point on. And after Watergate, after having been run 4 or 5 or 6 departments at the Washington Post, I knew I was on a carousel. I was always going to be on that level, and I was open to going someplace else to run my own paper, because after all, working at the Washington Post, especially after Watergate, was a very luxurious line of work.
Mm-hmm.
And even before Watergate, when I was foreign editor, that's the high cotton in journalism in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that I was running my own paper. And when the opportunity presented itself, and I was invited to be interviewed for this job of running the 2 papers as they then were, I looked at it, and while I never had thought of working in Albany as Albany, I liked the man who was doing the interviewing, Roger Greer, who was the publisher, and I thought this was an opportunity for me to do what I had, by that time, wanted to do for a number of years. So I also took a look at the papers. I saw that I could make a contribution, and so I took the job, and I was very glad that I did.
Well, Albany's lucky to have had you. I know, it must have been an interesting transition for you, being inside the Beltway and in that world of Washington, so deeply integrated into the inner workings, if you will, of the government, and both nationally and internationally, and then to move, to upstate New York, I think is an interesting transition, possibly.
Well, it was for me. It was less of an interesting transition than for my wife and the one daughter that was still at home. To them, it was a vast social change in their world to begin with. But for me, I was absorbed by the challenges that come with being totally responsible for a newspaper. Not responsible for one department in a newspaper, but for the whole newspaper, for the whole editorial side of the paper. And I found that extremely engaging. And there were a lot of problems, and that was good. That's what attracted me, that there was a point to my coming here and being here and applying the things that I had learned over decades at 2 great newspapers, and applying those lessons and adapting them to the needs of the Albany paper.
And are we...
I was not looking over my shoulder. As a matter of fact, while I was here about a year, Ben Bradley called me to offer me the job of running the European edition of the Herald Tribune, which the Washington Post then owned along with the New York Times. And I turned them down. I was more interested in staying where I was. Now, as being editor of the Paris Herald was a much more prestigious job than the one in Albany, but I was in the middle. I was just not in the middle. I was at the very beginning of trying to put into effect the changes that I wanted to make at these papers, and I wasn't going to turn my back on them.
And I think you retired in 1998. Is that correct, Harry?
Right.
And do you still I think we hopefully have it right that you still do some consulting for the Albany Times-Union?
Yes. And I still sit on the editorial board, and I go in a couple of times a week for editorial board meetings, and I go in when we have visitors of some note to help in the interviewing of those people. It keeps me busy.
So you're doing all that, and then you also wrote a book. And can you switch gears a little bit and tell us about using this, how you came about wanting to write your memoir? I left out the fact that for many of these years, I also continued to write my Sunday column, which I had begun while I was working, but which had, as I stepped back from everyday participation in the paper, when I began the column, it was mostly about explaining the workings of the newspapers to our readers, why we did the crazy things we did, and apologizing when apologies were necessary, and explaining how we had made mistakes, and explaining when we defended ourselves and said, no, we actually hadn't made a mistake. But when I was no longer directly involved, I expanded the parameters of what I would write about to anything that occurred to me, which was very liberating. It was hard work, but it was fun. But Alyssa, nagging at me for a long time was the notion. I knew very little about what had happened to my parents, their young peoplehood. Very little, and I never had interested myself to ask while there was still time. And I didn't want that to happen for my kids or my grandchildren, who by then were around, some of them. And so I began with the thought that I needed to put a story of my life together, of our families together, my wife's family and mine, for our family. And in time, that thought blossomed into writing something that might be worthy of public consumption. And that's when we came to the notion of a memoir.
And it's I would imagine, a very different type of writing than you had done before, and certainly your work as an editor is very different than writing something so personal and so close to your own experience.
Exactly, and very difficult. Very difficult. First of all, it's solitary. You're not working with colleagues. You're not in a situation where you can consult, you can discuss, and back and forth. You're consulting yourself, you're reflecting. On the other hand, you're bringing to it the discipline of your craft, which is to say that you want to be as truthful as you possibly can and as accurate as you possibly can. And that also becomes difficult when the documentary information is rather skimpy. So and then it becomes somewhat, on occasion, painful to revisit, especially my youth. Also to revisit the painful times when I was making my way in newspaper work. It wasn't all strawberries and cream, and all of that runs through your mind. Sometimes often it caused me not to sleep very well. And then you put it down on paper, and you look at it, and you say to yourself, well, who would care about this besides yourself? You know, it's a very scary undertaking.
And as far as, I think that's a good question that you bring up. As far as intended audience, who would you like to read the book, and what sort of impact would you like it to have potentially?
Well, the answer to that question was obviously everybody. Failing that, I am instructed by the book tour that I went on, which was truly a national book tour, east to west, south to north. And I met many, many people in many, many venues, and I was amazed at the number of people that came out to hear me in different places, universities and senior citizen centers, libraries and bookstores, and I found people responded to different aspects of the book. Some to my childhood, some to my career in journalism, some to my Army service, and what pleased me most is that the ones who talked to me about it then began to tell stories of their own that somehow related to what I had experienced. And I found that very rewarding. That and it made an impact far beyond the one that I had supposed, which was, of course, the journalism community or the people who were interested in journalism as such, because I was active at a time when you can say that American journalism was in one of its golden stages. Maybe not the golden stage. I won't be presumptuous to claim that, but it certainly was a special time that came to pass. And it came to pass in my own lifetime. And we were there and we had the chance. Historic events confronted us and we dealt with them to the best of our talents. And the world changed.
Yeah.
I mean, the civil rights movement changed this country. The Vietnam War changed this country. And Watergate changed this country. And we were there and had the ability, had the good luck to be able to write about it.
And that's really one of the reasons that I had really wanted you on this show was also because as we're beginning the School of Social Welfare, we're beginning to talk to our students about the importance of media, not so much in the journalism sense, but just looking at media and saying, how do we get our message out there? How do we look at the public as a client and get our message out there to the larger audience about social work topics? And I think through the show, this segment that when you've discussed, you've talked about the importance of media and why it's important for the public to know. But what message would you like to leave to maybe students who are interested, even if they're not interested in journalism per se, but so any individual from the School of Social Work who might be interested in using the media? What are the benefits to be able to get a message out there to the public, be it about a certain social topic of social justice or a research that is going on in the field? What's something that's something that's a message from you that's important to a social worker to say, this is why media is important?
Well, media is important because it by the definition of the word, it reaches out to the multitude, and you don't know which plot of soil the acorn is going to grow in. So you have to scatter your seeds. You have to scatter your information in order to accumulate a support for the ideas that you're trying to develop. You can't do this locked up in a room, even a classroom. You can begin it there, you can nurture it there, you can develop it there, but you must promulgate if you're interested in that. If you need political support, if you need public support, if you need financial support, that the media would be the way to reach out to the possibility of making those connections. And you do that, I mean, you can do that with propaganda. or you can do it with factual information. And I think that choice is yours, but I obviously come down on the side of information.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Harry. That's really great information to share with us and our school and everyone who's listening. Because we're running out of time, but what's next for you? What do you see yourself continuing to do, or any another book, or what do you see in the future for you?
Well, I hope to continue breathing.
We hope so too.
I keep on working on this and that. I'm writing and rewriting things, but what they are, I do not, at this point, want to put a name to it.
Okay.
I really admire, just from listening to you, Harry, your ability to kind of follow this trajectory in your life. And you mentioned earlier the carousel of the journalism world, particularly in Washington, D.C., but just throughout your life, it seems like you've really followed a path that is unique, and you've been open to possibility and open to following opportunities that really mean something to you and that matter, rather than just following a career or following money. So, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and sort of as maybe a way to close out the conversation about your memoirs, about, just how you've really followed this trajectory in your life that's more driven by mission than anything else.
Well, it was never driven by money, because if it was driven by money, I made a very bad choice. But I did see it, and the longer I was in it, I had more confirming evidence that journalism, good journalism, can be an important tool. It is very self-satisfying to begin with, but it is also a contribution to the public good, and that really, I recognized that as I went along, and it was always in my mind. And I have tried very hard to be professional in the sense of adhering to standards and walking a straight path. I wasn't deflected in my own sense by the new journalism that introduced a highly subjective form of journalism. This apotheosis you could see in the Rolling Stone article that we've all heard about.
Yeah.
And I believe very firmly in a democracy. Journalism is absolutely, free press is absolutely essential, and that means that it's absolutely essential that those who practice journalism do an honorable and good job.
Well, they're very inspiring words, Harry, and I thank you so much. We both thank you, Alyssa, and I thank you for being on the show, certainly for writing your memoirs, for sharing your life experience with the world at large. And I hope you'll also consider maybe coming down to the School of Social Welfare and talking to some of our students and faculty, because we know, speaking as a faculty member, we would certainly like to learn from someone like you, and I think you really have a lot to share.
It'd be my pleasure to do so.
Great. Thank you.
I thank you both. I found this a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you so much. We wish you the best in your next endeavors, too.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay, so we've just been listening to an interview with Harry Rosenfeld, who was editor at the New York Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, and the Times-Union here in Albany. Harry has just written a memoir called From Kristallnacht to Watergate, Memoirs of a Newspaperman. You can find that online. If you Google the title, or if you Google Harry Rosenfeld, you should be able to find that. We thank you so much for listening, and we're going to play a little bit of music here, and then we'll be back with one more short segment from the social workers, and we'll call it a week. Thanks again for listening here on WCDB Albany.